In the summer of 1882, deep in the shadow of Tennessee's Smoky Mountains, there existed a place that maps forgot to mark. Blackwood Basin lay hidden behind walls of granite and pine, accessible only by a single treacherous path that wound through mist and silence. The air there carried something wrong, something that made even the boldest travelers quicken their pace and avoid looking back. Local folklore whispered of the family that claimed this cursed hollow as their domain. The Croggins had ruled their isolated kingdom for generations, breeding among themselves until their bloodline grew as twisted as the gnarled trees that surrounded their compound. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones of strange births, of children who disappeared before their first winter, of brides who arrived hopeful and departed as corpses. But in 1882, one bride would break that pattern forever. Before we go on, tell me in the comments where you are watching from. If this is your first time here, subscribe because the story I am about to tell goes beyond anything you can imagine. On the night of August 30th, Alara Vesta would commit an act so calculated, so perfectly timed that it would destroy a dynasty that had festered in isolation for decades. This was not just murder, this was retribution generations in the making. On the night of August 30th, 1882, Alara Vesta murdered her husband. The official record tells a different story, of course. According to the coroner's inquest filed 3 days later, Silas Croggin died from accidental consumption of toxic flora, a tragic mistake made by a grieving widow who confused deadly foxglove for harmless herbs while preparing a nighttime remedy. The subsequent fire that consumed the entire Croggin compound was attributed to a lightning strike, despite witnesses reporting clear skies that evening. But tucked away in a collection of family papers discovered nearly a century later, researchers found something that shattered this comfortable lie. A letter written in Alara's own hand, mailed from a town 50 miles away just 15 days after the fire. The words she penned to her younger sister Laurel were stark, unrepentant, and chilling in their matter-of-fact confession. "Dearest Laurel," the letter begins, "I write to tell you that your sister is no murderer, though I have indeed taken a life. What I did to Silas Croggin was not born of rage or madness, but of a terrible clarity. I put foxglove in his whiskey with the same precision a surgeon uses his blade, knowing that his death would free not just myself, but every woman who might have followed me into that cursed basin." The letter goes on to describe in meticulous detail how she planned and executed not just the poisoning, but the systematic destruction of the entire Croggin homestead. She writes of finding the diary of her predecessor, a young woman named Abigail Miller, who had disappeared under mysterious circumstances 4 years earlier. She describes the horror of learning what truly happened to the women who came before her, and her cold determination to ensure no others would share their fate. "I am not a murderer, sister," the letter concludes. "I am a reaper, and I have harvested the rotten crop." The question that haunts researchers to this day is not whether Alara committed this act. The evidence is overwhelming. The question is whether she was a monster who deserves condemnation, or an avenging angel who delivered justice to a place where law and decency had never taken root. To answer that question, we must first understand the hell into which she was delivered, and the family that had turned isolation into an art form of horror. Blackwood Basin exists in a geography of despair, carved into the eastern face of the Smoky Mountains by some ancient catastrophe. The valley sits like a wound in the earth, surrounded by cliffs so steep that even mountain goats struggle to find purchase on their faces. The single road leading into the basin, optimistically called the Descent by locals, is little more than a wagon track that switchbacks down granite walls in a series of hairpin turns that have claimed dozens of lives over the decades. From the rim, visitors could look down into the valley and see what appeared to be a pastoral scene. Green meadows dotted with wildflowers and a crystal stream winding through stands of ancient oak and hickory. But those who made the treacherous journey down discovered that beauty was an illusion, maintained only by distance. The air in the basin carried an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on the lungs and spirit alike. The stream that sparkled so invitingly from above revealed itself to be choked with algae and debris, its water carrying a metallic taste that warned against consumption. The meadows, viewed up close, were pocked with sinkholes and boggy patches that could swallow a horse and rider without warning. At the far end of the valley, where the mountains closed in like cupped hands, stood the Croghan compound. From a distance, it might have been mistaken for any other mountain homestead, a collection of log cabins and outbuildings clustered around a central yard. But closer inspection revealed structures that seemed to lean away from each other, as if the very buildings were trying to escape their foundations. The wood was soft with rot, the chinking between logs blackened with mold, and the windows were either boarded shut or covered with oiled paper that filtered the light into a sickly yellow glow. The nearest settlement of any size was Mercy's End, a logging town perched on the rim of the basin 15 miles from the Croghan homestead. The people of Mercy's End maintained a careful relationship with their isolated neighbors, one built on mutual need and mutual fear. The Croghans provided moonshine that could strip paint and cure everything from rheumatism to heartbreak. In return, Mercy's End provided supplies, news from the outside world, and most importantly, silence about what everyone suspected, but no one dared investigate. The town's newspaper, the Mercy's End Ledger, rarely mentioned the Croghans directly, but careful readers could detect their influence in the stories it chose not to tell. Missing persons reports that appeared once and were never followed up, court notices for land disputes that were suddenly withdrawn, birth and death announcements that contained impossible dates and relationships. This landscape didn't just hide a family, it bred one. The patriarch of this twisted dynasty was Mordecai Croghan, a man whose intelligence was exceeded only by his ruthless pragmatism. Confined to a wheelchair by a logging accident in his youth, Mordecai had channeled his physical limitations into an iron grip on his family's destiny. From his seat by the great hearth that dominated the main cabin, he conducted the clan's affairs with the precision of a chess master, seeing moves and counter-moves that stretched years into the future. Mordecai understood better than anyone the biological mathematics of his family's situation. Generations of intermarriage had concentrated their bloodline until it ran thick with genetic poison. Children were born with cleft palates, twisted spines, and minds that functioned like broken clockwork. Many didn't survive their first winter, succumbing to ailments that had no names but were as predictable as the changing seasons. Yet Mordecai also recognized opportunity in this curse. The family's isolation and their reputation for strangeness made them valuable to certain elements in the broader community. Their moonshine operation provided income, but more importantly, it provided leverage. Few lawmen were eager to investigate reports of wrongdoing in a place where witnesses tended to disappear, and evidence had a way of being consumed by mysterious fires. The crown jewel of Mordecai's breeding program was his nephew Silas, the last viable male heir of the Croghan line. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with shoulders that could have carried a plow horse, Silas possessed the physical strength that made him valuable as both enforcer and symbol of the family's power. But nature's gifts had come at a terrible price. His cleft palate made speech difficult and painful, reducing his communication to grunts and gestures that his family interpreted with disturbing fluency. His mind, while not entirely vacant, operated at the level of a child, prone to violent tantrums when frustrated or confused. Managing Silas's volatile nature fell largely to his cousin Caleb, a wiry man whose sharp features and calculating eyes marked him as, perhaps, the most dangerous member of the clan. Where Silas provided brute force, Caleb supplied cunning and cruelty in equal measure. He managed the family's moonshine trade, ensuring that their customers remained dependent and their competitors remained buried in the family cemetery that sprawled across the hillside above the compound. The oldest member of the clan, and perhaps its most mysterious, was Maud Croghan, known to everyone simply as Auntie. Ancient beyond reckoning, she moved through the compound like a living shadow, her presence both comforting and deeply unsettling. Auntie possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of mountain folklore and herbal medicine that made her invaluable to the community as healer and midwife. But her remedies came with a price, and those who couldn't pay in coin often found themselves indebted in ways they hadn't anticipated. The family graveyard told the true story of the Croghan dynasty. Headstones clustered together in impossible relationships, showing dates that revealed children born to their own grandparents, marriages between siblings, and generations that seemed to fold back on themselves like a serpent eating its own tail. The names repeated with monotonous regularity, Mordecai and Silas and Caleb appearing again and again across decades of crude stone markers. What the graveyard didn't show were the unmarked graves that dotted the hillside beyond the formal plots. Local legend claimed these held the remains of outsiders who had wandered too close to family secrets, but whispered conversations in Mercy's End suggested something far more systematic and disturbing. But a dynasty needs new blood to survive, and in the summer of 1882, Mordecai went shopping for it. The people of Mercy's End possessed collective memory that functioned like a sieve, allowing comfortable truths to settle while disturbing realities drained away into darkness. But some stories proved too heavy to disappear entirely, and the tale of Abigail Miller was one such stubborn ghost that haunted the town's conscience. Abigail had arrived in the spring of 1878, a delicate young woman with cornflower blue eyes and hair the color of autumn wheat. She came as payment for a debt her father owed to Mordecai Croghan, a transaction that the town's more respectable citizens chose to view as a marriage arrangement rather than acknowledge its true nature as human trafficking. The wedding had been performed by Reverend Thorne, the same man who would later officiate at Alara's ceremony, in a brief service notable for its complete lack of joy or celebration. Abigail's father had attended, but his face carried the expression of a man watching his daughter's funeral rather than her wedding. The bride herself had remained silent throughout the ceremony, her eyes fixed on something no one else could see. For the first few months after the wedding, Abigail made occasional appearances in town, usually accompanied by Caleb or one of the other Croghan men who watched her with the attention of prison guards. Shopkeepers noted that she grew thinner with each visit, her complexion taking on a grayish pallor that spoke of poor nutrition and little sunlight. Her bright dresses were gradually replaced with darker, more concealing garments that hid what some suspected were bruises and other marks of abuse. By winter, Abigail's visits to town had stopped entirely. When concerned citizens asked after her health, they were told she was experiencing a difficult pregnancy and required rest. This explanation satisfied most inquiries, though some noted that pregnancies typically lasted 9 months, not the 18 months that Abigail remained hidden from view. The end came suddenly and with little fanfare. In late summer of 1879, word spread through Mercy's End that young Mrs. Croghan had died in childbirth, along with her infant son. The funeral was private, attended only by family members, and the burial took place in the Croghan cemetery without outside witnesses. But Auntie Maud, in one of her increasingly rare visits to town, let slip details that didn't align with the official story. Speaking to Sarah Henderson, the town's most accomplished gossip, She mentioned that poor Abigail had suffered terribly in her final months, wasting away despite all the family's efforts to restore her health. She described symptoms that sounded less like pregnancy complications and more like systematic poisoning, slow doses of something that hollowed out the body while leaving the mind cruelly intact. That girl knew what was happening to her. Auntie confided in what she thought was a private conversation. Wrote it all down in a little book she kept hidden. Smart thing, that one. Too smart for her own good, if you take my meaning. The implications of these words sent ripples of unease through the community, but like so many uncomfortable truths, they were allowed to sink beneath the surface of daily concern. Life continued, debts accumulated, and when Hiram Vesta found himself unable to pay what he owed to Mordecai Croghan, the town prepared to witness history repeat itself. The warnings were there, preserved in whispered conversations and knowing glances, but the transaction was already complete. The economic realities of Reconstruction-era Tennessee created opportunities for men like Mordecai Croghan to acquire what they needed through methods that more civilized communities would have found abhorrent. In a region where currency was scarce and credit was king, debts became chains that bound families to decisions they would never have made in prosperity. Hiram Vesta represented everything Mordecai despised about the changing world beyond the basin. A former schoolteacher turned failed shopkeeper, Hiram possessed education but lacked the practical skills necessary to survive in a landscape where violence often trumped knowledge. His general store in Mercy's End had struggled from the day it opened, unable to compete with established merchants who had survived the war years through adaptability and ruthless pragmatism. By the spring of 1882, Hiram's debts to Mordecai had grown beyond any hope of repayment through conventional means. What had begun as small loans for inventory and supplies had metastasized into an obligation that consumed every dollar the store generated. The ledger that documented this financial relationship made fascinating reading for anyone interested in the mechanics of economic predation. Each entry showed Mordecai's careful cultivation of dependency, loans offered at moments of desperate need, with terms that ensured continued reliance. Interest rates that seemed reasonable when applied to small amounts became crushing when compounded over months and years. Collateral agreements that appeared to cover only the store's inventory gradually expanded to include the building, the land, and eventually everything Hiram owned or might ever own. The final entry in the ledger was made in Mordecai's distinctive handwriting on a warm day in June when the balance had grown beyond Hiram's ability to service even the interest. But instead of foreclosure, Mordecai offered a different solution, one that would clear the debt entirely and provide security for Hiram's family's future. The proposal was presented as a marriage arrangement, a union between Mordecai's nephew Silas and Hiram's eldest daughter Elara. Such arrangements were not uncommon in rural communities where practical considerations often outweighed romantic ideals. What made this particular proposition unusual was the complete absence of negotiation or discussion of terms beyond the simple cancellation of debt. Elara, who at 22 was considered by many to be approaching spinsterhood, was not consulted about this arrangement until it had been finalized. When Hiram finally summoned the courage to inform his daughter of her destiny, he found her response both unexpected and deeply unsettling. Rather than tears or protests, Elara listened to the proposal with the calm attention she had once given to difficult mathematical problems during her brief time as a student. She asked practical questions about the timeline, the location of the ceremony, and what provisions would be made for her younger sister Laurel's welfare. When Hiram finished explaining the arrangement, she nodded once and asked for time to consider her response. 3 days later, Elara agreed to the marriage on one condition: that Laurel would be protected from any similar arrangement in the future. Mordecai's acceptance of this term was immediate and enthusiastic, suggesting he had anticipated this negotiation and prepared for it accordingly. And so, with the ink dry on a ledger, Alara Vesta walked into the mouth of the beast, carrying with her a resolve that would prove more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Tell me in the comments, have you ever encountered a situation where someone's desperation made them vulnerable to exploitation? Subscribe if you want to see how this story of calculated revenge continues to unfold, because what happens next will challenge everything you think you know about justice and survival. The Croghan compound operated according to rules that had been refined over generations of isolation and paranoia. Every aspect of daily life was designed to maintain control, prevent escape, and ensure that family secrets remained buried in the shadows of Blackwood Basin. Alara's introduction to her new home began the moment she stepped from her father's wagon onto the packed earth of the compound's central yard. Her personal belongings, a single traveling bag containing her few dresses and precious books, were immediately confiscated by Caleb under the pretense of inspection for contraband. The books, he declared after a cursory examination, contained ideas that might prove disruptive to family harmony and would be stored safely until she had adapted to her new circumstances. The cabin designated as her new home was a study in calculated deprivation. Smaller than the chicken coop behind her father's store, it contained a rough bed, a single wooden chair, and a table barely large enough to hold a wash basin and pitcher. The windows were positioned too high to see out of while seated, and their glass was so thick and clouded that the outside world appeared as nothing more than indistinct shapes and shadows. More disturbing than the physical limitations were the human ones. Alara quickly discovered that she was never alone, never unwatched, never free to move about the compound without escort. Caleb had assigned various family members to monitor her activities in shifts, a rotation that ensured constant surveillance while giving the watchers plausible deniability about their role as prison guards. The daily routine was as rigid as any military institution. Meals were served at precise times in the main cabin's common room, with seating arrangements that placed Alara between Silas and Auntie Maud, where conversation was both limited and carefully monitored. The food itself was adequate but monotonous, consisting mainly of cornbread, beans, and whatever meat the family's hunting provided. Work assignments kept Alara occupied from dawn until dusk, with tasks that served dual purposes of utility and control. She was responsible for tending the vegetable garden that provided much of the family's fresh food, work that kept her visible to multiple observers while teaching her which plants were safe to consume and which were not. Her education proved useful in maintaining the family's correspondence with their few outside contacts, though every letter she wrote was reviewed and approved before being sent. The compound's layout revealed the paranoid genius of its design. The main cabin occupied the center of the compound, with clear sightlines to every other building. The various workshops, storage sheds, and living quarters were positioned to create overlapping fields of observation, ensuring that movement between buildings could be tracked and controlled. The single road leading out of the valley was visible from multiple vantage points, making unauthorized departures virtually impossible. But it was the subtle psychological controls that proved most effective at maintaining order. The family possessed an intricate knowledge of each other's weaknesses and fears, information that was deployed with surgical precision to prevent rebellion or resistance. Conversations were peppered with references to previous outsiders who had struggled to adapt to Basin life, their fates left deliberately vague but ominously suggestive. Silas himself represented both the greatest threat and the most vulnerable point in this system of control. His massive physical presence made resistance seem futile, but his limited mental capacity created opportunities for manipulation by anyone clever enough to understand his simple needs and desires. The family had trained him to view Alara as his property, but they had also taught him to value that property and protect it from harm. The nightly routine proved most revealing about the family's methods of control. Each evening after supper, Silas would retreat to his quarters with a pewter cup filled with the family's potent moonshine, a ritual that served multiple purposes. The alcohol moderated his violent impulses, provided him with the only pleasure his limited existence contained, and ensured that he slept deeply enough to prevent nocturnal wandering that might disrupt family routines. Trapped and watched, surrounded by people who viewed her as livestock rather than human, Alara's despair began to curdle into something else entirely, something that would prove far more dangerous than her captors could have anticipated. Discovery came through the kind of accident that fate seems to arrange for those desperate enough to recognize opportunity in the smallest cracks of possibility. While sweeping the floors of her assigned cabin on a humid morning in late July, Alara noticed that one of the wide plank boards near the fireplace gave slightly when she stepped on it, producing a hollow sound that spoke of empty space beneath. Careful investigation revealed that the board could be lifted, exposing a hiding place that had been carved into the foundation stones below. Within this crude vault, wrapped in oiled cloth and hidden away like buried treasure, lay the diary of Abigail Miller, the previous bride whose fate had been reduced to whispered rumors and half-remembered warnings. The diary's pages, filled with Abigail's careful handwriting, told a story that transformed Alara's understanding of her situation from unfortunate circumstances to systematic horror. Abigail had been an educated woman like herself, capable of detailed observation and analysis, and she had documented every aspect of her captivity with the precision of a naturalist studying a particularly venomous species of spider. The early entries revealed the same pattern of control that Alara was experiencing: the constant surveillance, the rigid routines, the psychological pressure designed to break down resistance and create compliance. But as weeks became months, Abigail's writing began to document something far more sinister than simple imprisonment. "They are experimenting on me," read one entry dated 6 months after her arrival. "Each morning Auntie brings me tea that tastes of bitter herbs and leaves me feeling weak and nauseated. When I refuse to drink it, Silas becomes violent, striking me until I comply. The bruises heal, but the sickness grows stronger each day." Later entries described Abigail's growing understanding of her role in the family's breeding program. She was not just a wife, but a laboratory animal, subjected to various concoctions and treatments designed to improve her fertility and ensure the health of any offspring she might produce. The irony was cruel beyond measure. A family so damaged by inbreeding was now poisoning the very woman they hoped would provide genetic salvation. The most disturbing passages described Abigail's gradual realization that she was not the first woman to occupy this role. References to previous occupants of her cabin, their belongings still hidden in various caches throughout the compound, their fates universally tragic. Some had died in childbirth, others had succumbed to the very treatments meant to improve their health, and a few had simply vanished entirely, their disappearances attributed to everything from wild animals to religious calling. But it was the diary's final entries that transformed Alara's fear into cold, focused rage. Abigail had discovered she was pregnant, a development that initially brought her hope for improved treatment and possible escape. Instead, the family's experimentation had intensified, with Auntie introducing new compounds that were meant to ensure the child's health, but were slowly killing both mother and baby. "He knows," read the last entry in handwriting that had grown increasingly shaky. Silas knows I am carrying his child, and still he allows them to poison me. I see it in his eyes when he brings the evening draft, a mixture that burns my throat and makes my heart race until I think it will burst. I believe they mean for me to die in childbirth, taking with me any knowledge of their methods. The diary ended there. But the implications were clear. Abigail had died not from pregnancy complications, but from systematic poisoning, her death timed to coincide with childbirth to provide a plausible explanation for outside authorities. Her child, if it had survived birth at all, had undoubtedly joined the unmarked graves that dotted the hillside above the compound. Now, armed with the knowledge of her predecessor's fate, armed with proof of the family's methods and intentions, Ilara knew she had only one path to survival. But first, she would need to acquire the means to walk that path, and Abigail's diary had provided her with detailed information about where such means might be found. The vegetable garden that had initially seemed like a simple work assignment now revealed itself as a carefully curated pharmacy of death and healing. Under Auntie Maud's indirect tutelage, Ilara began to understand the dual nature of the plants she tended daily, each species possessing properties that could either cure or kill depending on preparation and dosage. Foxglove grew in abundance along the garden's northern border, its tall spikes of purple flowers beautiful enough to grace any parlor bouquet. But Auntie's seemingly casual comments about the plant's properties revealed a more sinister purpose. The leaves, when properly dried and powdered, could slow a racing heart or stop it entirely, the difference measured in grains of powder too small for the untrained eye to distinguish. Powerful medicine, that foxglove, Auntie observed during one of their garden sessions, her ancient fingers caressing the plant's velvety leaves. The mountain folk call it witch's glove, and with good reason. It can call back a soul that's trying to leave, or send one along its way if the dosage runs heavy. Takes a knowing hand to use it proper. Ilara absorbed these lessons with the attention of a devoted student, memorizing every detail about harvesting techniques, drying methods, and the subtle signs that indicated optimal potency. She learned to identify the plant's active compounds by taste, the bitter alkaloids that made foxglove so dangerous to the inexperienced, but so valuable to those who understood its secrets. Opportunity for harvesting came during the busy preparations for her wedding day, when the entire family was occupied with arrangements and celebrations. While Caleb supervised the construction of tables for the reception and Silas practiced his limited wedding vows with Mordecai, Ilara slipped away to the garden with a basket and pruning shears, ostensibly to gather flowers for decoration. The foxglove leaves she selected were perfect specimens, mature enough to contain maximum concentrations of active compounds, but young enough to dry evenly without developing the mold that could compromise their potency. She harvested sparingly, taking only what she needed while leaving enough plants intact to avoid notice. The drying process required patience and precision that tested every ounce of Ilara's self-control. The leaves had to be spread thinly in a location with good air circulation, but protected from direct sunlight that could degrade their active compounds. She found the perfect spot in her cabin's attic space, accessible through a small hatch that no one else bothered to investigate. Each day she climbed up to check the progress of her deadly harvest, turning the leaves carefully to ensure even drying and watching for the subtle changes in color and texture that indicated readiness. The process took nearly 2 weeks, time during which she maintained her normal routines while secretly preparing for an act that would either free her or destroy her. The final step required grinding the dried leaves into a fine powder, work that had to be done silently and in complete secrecy. Using a smooth river stone and a wooden bowl she had liberated from the kitchen during cleanup duties, Alara spent her evenings reducing the foxglove leaves to a powder so fine it felt like silk between her fingers. The finished product filled a small cloth pouch that could be easily concealed in the folds of her wedding dress. Innocent enough to escape casual observation, but containing sufficient poison to kill a man 3 times Silas's size. All that remained was waiting for the right moment, the perfect opportunity to transform weeks of careful preparation into a single decisive act. As the sun set on her wedding day, all the pieces were in place, waiting only for darkness to reveal whether Alara Vesta possessed the resolve to become something her captors had never imagined possible. The wedding ceremony itself was a mockery of every sacred tradition, a commercial transaction disguised with religious language and social convention. Reverend Thorne arrived at the compound in the early afternoon, his usual fire and brimstone demeanor replaced by the nervous deference of a man who knew he was participating in something fundamentally wrong but lacked the courage to refuse. The Reverend's discomfort was evident in every aspect of his abbreviated service. His normally booming voice reduced to barely audible mumbles, his eyes fixed on the ground rather than meeting those of the bride or groom, his hands shaking as he fumbled through pages of scripture that seemed to stick together with deliberate malice. The ceremony lasted barely 10 minutes, concluding with vows that Silas could not pronounce and Alara would not honor. Payment for these services came in the form of a leather pouch that clinked with silver coins, compensation generous enough to ensure the Reverend's silence about the details of what he had witnessed. His hurried departure immediately after the ceremony spoke volumes about his eagerness to distance himself from whatever consequences might follow. The wedding feast that followed was a study in forced celebration, family members going through the motions of joy while their eyes remained cold and calculating. The food was more elaborate than usual, featuring a roasted pig that had been slaughtered for the occasion and vegetables from the garden that Alara had tended with such careful attention to their hidden properties. But it was the drinking that commanded the most attention, with jugs of the family's most potent moonshine flowing freely among the male guests, while women were offered a weaker version that was intended to loosen tongues without completely compromising judgment. Alara noticed that her own cup was filled with something different entirely, a mixture that tasted of herbs and carried the bitter undertones of compounds she had learned to identify during her botanical education. Silas consumed alcohol with the methodical determination of a man performing a familiar ritual. His pewter cup, polished to a dull gleam for the occasion, never remained empty for more than a few minutes before being refilled by one family member or another. The alcohol seemed to calm his nervous energy and reduce the violent outbursts that marked his normal behavior, transforming him from dangerous animal into merely unpleasant company. Mordecai's toast to the happy couple revealed the true nature of the evening's purpose. "To a new generation," he declared, raising his own cup in a gesture that managed to be both celebratory and threatening. "To fresh blood that will carry the Croghan name into the next century, and to the strength that comes from keeping our own counsel in a world that would judge what it cannot understand." The words carried implications that chilled Alara more than the mountain air, confirmation that she was viewed not as a wife but as breeding stock, valued only for her potential to produce offspring that might dilute the poison that flowed through Croghan veins. The assembled family members drank to this sentiment with enthusiasm that bordered on religious fervor. As evening approached and the wedding guests began their preparations for departure, Alara felt the weight of the small pouch hidden in her dress like a burning coal against her skin. Every movement risked detection. Every casual gesture might reveal the instrument of her liberation or her doom. The final act of this grotesque theater came when Mordecai formally presented Silas with a key to the cabin that would serve as their marital home, a gesture that transformed Alara's prison from temporary accommodation into permanent residence. The symbolism was lost on no one present, least of all the bride herself. As the last of the guests departed and the compound settled into the quiet rhythms of evening, Alara and Silas found themselves alone in the cabin that would witness either her submission or her rebellion. The choice between these fates would be made before dawn, and the consequences would reshape the destiny of everyone who called Blackwood Basin home. The marital cabin felt smaller in the darkness, its rough log walls pressing inward like the sides of a coffin as Alara and her new husband settled into their grim domestic arrangement. Silas moved through the cramped space with the heavy, deliberate motions of a man whose physical size made every gesture potentially threatening, while Alara remained motionless in her chair, hands folded in her lap to conceal their trembling. The ritual of Silas's evening drink proceeded with the predictability of a church service. From a cabinet beside the fireplace, he withdrew his pewter cup and a ceramic jug that contained the family's finest moonshine, aged in charred oak barrels that gave the liquor a smoky complexity that almost masked its devastating potency. The measurement was precise, filling the cup exactly 3/4 full, no more and no less. This was the moment Alara had planned for, practiced for, steeled herself to execute with the cold precision of a surgical procedure. As Silas set the jug aside and turned toward the fireplace to stoke the dying embers into renewed life, she rose from her chair with movements that felt disconnected from her conscious will. The small cloth pouch came free from its hiding place, with a whisper of fabric that seemed thunderously loud in the cabin's silence. Her fingers, steady now despite the magnitude of what they were about to accomplish, worked at the pouch's drawstring with the efficiency of long practice. The foxglove powder within was as fine as flour, ground to a consistency that would dissolve completely in alcohol without leaving trace of its presence. Time expanded and contracted like a bellows as Alara moved toward the pewter cup, each step carrying her further from the woman she had been and closer to something she had never imagined becoming. The powder poured from the pouch in a thin stream that disappeared into the moonshine as completely as hope vanishing into despair. Silas remained focused on his fire building, unaware that death was dissolving into his evening comfort mere feet behind him. When he finally turned back to retrieve his cup, Alara had already returned to her chair, the empty pouch once again hidden in the folds of her dress, her expression carefully composed into the passive mask that had served her so well during her weeks of captivity. The first sip brought no immediate reaction, foxglove's effects being subtle and delayed compared to more dramatic poisons. Silas drank with his usual methodical approach, consuming half the cup's contents before pausing to tend the fire once more. The second half disappeared more quickly, drained in a series of swallows that sealed his fate, as surely as if he had signed his own death warrant. The waiting that followed tested Alara's resolve more severely than any previous challenge. She sat motionless while Silas completed his evening routine, watching for the first signs that the poison was beginning its work. Foxglove acted by disrupting the heart's electrical system, causing irregular rhythms that could quickly progress to complete cardiac arrest. The first symptom appeared as a slight confusion, Silas pausing in the middle of removing his boots with an expression of puzzlement that suggested he had forgotten what he was doing. This was followed by visible sweating despite the cabin's cool temperature, his massive frame beginning to shed heat as his cardiovascular system struggled with its new biochemical reality. When the convulsions began, they came with a violence that transformed the cabin into a battlefield. Silas fell backward from his chair, his body arching and twisting as electrical chaos spread through his nervous system. His hands clawed at his chest as if trying to tear out the organ that was betraying him, while his feet drummed against the wooden floor in a rhythm that spoke of desperate struggle against inevitable surrender. Alara watched this display with a mixture of horror and fascination, simultaneously appalled by the suffering she had caused and grimly satisfied by the justice she was witnessing. This was retribution, not just for what Silas had done to her, but for what his family had done to Abigail Miller and whatever other women had preceded them into this basin of horrors. The end came more quickly than she had expected. The massive heart that had powered Silas's intimidating frame finally succumbing to the chemical assault she had launched against it. His final breath escaped in a sound that was part sigh and part rattle, carrying with it the last vestige of the Croghan family's genetic legacy. But killing Silas was only the first part of Alara's plan. The second part required destroying the entire compound before anyone could investigate the circumstances of his death or discover evidence of her carefully planned execution. From another hiding place, she retrieved a small bottle of lamp oil that she had been accumulating drop by drop over the previous weeks. The oil splashed across the cabin's dry wooden walls with the efficiency of long contemplation, creating trails of combustible material that would ensure complete destruction of the structure and everything within it. She saved the largest quantity for the bed where Silas lay still, dousing the rough blankets and straw mattress until they reeked of petroleum promise. The match she struck seemed impossibly bright in the cabin's darkness, its tiny flame containing the power to erase months of suffering and generations of accumulated evil. When she dropped it onto the oil-soaked bed, the fire that bloomed was beautiful in its terrible completeness. By the time Mercy's End saw the glow in the sky, Alara Vesta was already miles away, walking through mountain darkness toward a freedom purchased with foxglove and flame, leaving behind her the cremated remains of a dynasty that had finally fed upon itself. The official investigation into the Croghan compound fire was a masterpiece of deliberate incompetence, orchestrated by men who had no desire to examine too closely what they might find in the ashes. Sheriff Marcus Webb arrived from the county seat 3 days after the blaze, accompanied by Coroner Thomas Marsh, both men representing authorities who had spent years carefully avoiding any deep inquiry into Croghan family affairs. Their cursory examination of the burned structures revealed exactly what they expected to find, which was exactly what they wanted to find, which was nothing that would require additional investigation or uncomfortable questions. The official cause of death was listed as accidental consumption of toxic flora, with the suggestion that Silas had mistakenly ingested poisonous plants while treating some minor ailment. The fire itself was attributed to a lightning strike, despite the clear skies that multiple witnesses had observed throughout the evening. This explanation satisfied everyone involved in the investigation, from the sheriff who wanted to close the case quickly to the coroner who had received a generous donation to his retirement fund from the few surviving Croghan family members. But the real twist in this story was not the cover-up itself, which was transparent to anyone who cared to look closely. The real revelation was the systematic nature of what Alara had discovered and the scope of the horror she had chosen to end through her desperate act of violence. Abigail Miller's diary, which Alara had taken with her when she fled the burning compound, contained references to other documents and hiding places throughout the Croghan property. These materials, most of which were destroyed in the fire that consumed the main cabin, told a story that stretched back generations and involved far more victims than anyone had imagined. The Croghan family had not simply been practicing incest out of ignorance or necessity. They had been conducting a deliberate breeding experiment, attempting to concentrate certain genetic traits while using outside women as genetic material to prevent the complete collapse of their bloodline. This was not random violence or casual cruelty, but systematic exploitation disguised as marriage and family formation. The unmarked graves that dotted the hillside above the compound contained the remains of dozens of women who had been brought to the basin under various pretexts over the decades. Some had been sold to settle debts, others had been kidnapped outright, and a few had come willingly, lured by promises of marriage and security that turned into imprisonment and death. Each woman had been subjected to the same pattern of treatment that Abigail and Alara experienced: controlled experimentation designed to maximize fertility while gathering data about genetic inheritance and trait expression. The family maintained meticulous records of these experiments, documenting everything from physical measurements to psychological responses to various forms of stress and manipulation. The true architect of this system was not Silas, who was merely another victim of the family's genetic manipulations, nor even Mordecai, whose role was largely administrative. The driving force behind generations of systematic horror was Auntie Maud, the ancient matriarch whose knowledge of herbal medicine and human biology had enabled her to pursue her twisted vision of genetic perfection with scientific precision. What Alara had accomplished on her wedding night was not simply the murder of an abusive husband or escape from an unwanted marriage. She had identified and destroyed the central nervous system of an operation that had been consuming human lives for decades, ending a cycle of exploitation that had produced nothing but suffering and death. The fire she set was not just revenge, but purification, burning away generations of accumulated evil and ensuring that no future victims would be delivered to the altar of Krogan family ambition. In destroying the compound, she had also destroyed the records and infrastructure that made their systematic exploitation possible. With the official record sealed and the truth reduced to ashes, the story of what really happened in Blackwood Basin began its transformation from criminal investigation to local legend, leaving behind only echoes of a horror that few would believe and none could prove. The destruction of the Krogan compound created a vacuum in the social and economic structure of the region that was filled with remarkable speed by collective amnesia and deliberate forgetting. Within weeks of the fire, the official version of events had calcified into unquestionable truth, while any details that contradicted this narrative were dismissed as rumor and speculation. Mordecai Krogan survived the fire by virtue of sleeping in a separate cabin that escaped the initial conflagration, though smoke inhalation left him with respiratory problems that would plague him for the remainder of his considerably shortened life. Caleb also survived, having been away from the compound on family business when the fire started, but returned to find his carefully constructed world reduced to blackened timbers and ash. The survivors faced a choice between attempting to rebuild their operation or accepting defeat and dispersing to whatever refuge they could find in the broader world. The decision was made easier by the discovery that most of their accumulated wealth had been stored in the main cabin that was now a pile of charcoal and melted metal. Without the infrastructure that had supported their moonshine operation and lacking the manpower to maintain their various enterprises, the remnants of the Krogan clan found themselves in the unfamiliar position of being ordinary citizens, subject to ordinary laws. This transition proved more challenging than Mordecai's iron will could overcome. The land itself seemed to reject any attempt at renewal or reconstruction. The few structures that had survived the fire proved to be unstable and unsafe, requiring demolition for public safety. The wells that had provided water for the compound became contaminated with ash and debris, rendering them unusable without expensive restoration work that the family could no longer afford. Local wildlife, previously kept at bay by human activity, and the family's reputation for violence, began to reclaim the compound's cleared areas with remarkable speed. Within a year, what had once been carefully maintained gardens and pathways had become impassable thickets that effectively sealed off the ruins from casual exploration. The people of Mercy's End, meanwhile, discovered that life without the Croghan family's malevolent influence was considerably more peaceful and prosperous than anyone had dared hope. The moonshine trade that had provided the family's primary income was quickly absorbed by other producers who lacked the Croghans' taste for intimidation and violence. Property values in the region increased as the cloud of fear and superstition that had hung over Blackwood Basin began to dissipate. Settlers who had previously avoided the area began to investigate opportunities for farming and logging, bringing new economic activity and legitimate governance to a region that had operated outside normal social structures for generations. But the most significant change was in the collective memory of the community. Stories about the Croghan family that had once been whispered in private began to be discussed openly, though with important modifications that served to protect those who had remained silent during the family's reign of terror. The official narrative that emerged portrayed the Croghans as victims of their own isolation and genetic decline. Tragic figures who had succumbed to forces beyond their control rather than perpetrators of systematic evil. This version of events allowed the community to express sympathy for the family's suffering while avoiding uncomfortable questions about their own complicity in what had transpired. References to the women who had disappeared into the basin over the years were gradually edited out of local memory, replaced by vague mentions of deaths from natural causes and normal mortality rates. The unmarked graves that dotted the hillside above the former compound were attributed to a family cemetery that had been poorly maintained due to the survivors' declining mental capacity. Just because a story is buried doesn't mean it's dead, but in the case of the Croghan family's systematic exploitation of vulnerable women, burial proved remarkably effective at preventing uncomfortable truths from disturbing the community's peace of mind. More than a century has passed since the night Alara Vesta walked away from the burning Croghan compound, but the story continues to exercise a peculiar fascination over those who encounter its fragments in historical records and local folklore. Modern investigators armed with tools and perspectives unavailable to their 19th century predecessors have attempted to reconstruct what really happened in Blackwood Basin during those final violent hours. The site itself remains largely inaccessible to casual exploration, the narrow mountain road having deteriorated beyond practical use and the terrain having returned to wilderness that actively discourages human intrusion. Hikers who do manage to reach the former compound report an oppressive atmosphere that seems to persist despite the passage of decades, a sense of lingering wrongness that defies rational explanation. Ghost hunters and paranormal investigators have made pilgrimages to the ruins, equipped with electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, and audio recording equipment designed to capture evidence of supernatural activity. Their findings are typically inconclusive but consistently unsettling, filled with unexplained temperature variations, electronic malfunctions, and recordings of voices speaking words that no living person remembers uttering. Academic historians have shown more interest in the socio-economic factors that enabled the Croghan family's activities than in the supernatural elements of their story. Scholarly papers have analyzed the isolation and poverty that made systematic exploitation possible, drawing parallels to similar cases of family-based criminal enterprises in other remote regions during the same historical period. These academic studies have identified patterns of behavior that extend far beyond the specific circumstances of Blackwood Basin, revealing a network of isolated communities where traditional law enforcement was either absent or complicit in ongoing criminal activities. The Croghan case serves as a particularly well-documented example of how geographic isolation could enable multi-generational abuse and exploitation. Feminist scholars have focused attention on Ilara's story as an example of female agency in circumstances where such agency was supposedly impossible. Her careful planning and successful execution of both murder and escape represent a form of resistance that challenges traditional narratives about women's powerlessness in patriarchal societies. The story has also found new life in popular culture, inspiring novels, documentaries, and podcasts that explore themes of justice, revenge, and survival in extremis. These modern retellings often emphasize the moral ambiguity of Ilara's actions, presenting her simultaneously as victim and perpetrator, hero and villain, depending on the audience's perspective and values. Local tourism has begun to capitalize on the story's dark appeal, with guided tours that promise to reveal the true story of the Croghan family tragedy. These commercial ventures typically focus on the more sensational aspects of the tale, while avoiding the uncomfortable questions about community complicity that lie at its heart. Perhaps most significantly, the story continues to resonate because it addresses themes that remain relevant in contemporary society: the vulnerability of women in isolated circumstances, the failure of institutions to protect the powerless, and the question of when violence becomes justified as a response to systematic oppression. The pattern of isolation and exploitation that enabled the Croghan family's activities can be recognized in modern cases of human trafficking, cult activity, and domestic abuse, suggesting that the fundamental dynamics of power and vulnerability that made Ilara's situation possible have not disappeared with the passage of time. So what are we to make of Ilara Vesta's final terrible act of justice and the legacy it left behind? The competing narratives that surround the events of August 30th, 1882, present us with a choice between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths, between official explanations that preserve social order and evidence that challenges our assumptions about justice, morality, and the lengths to which desperate people will go to secure their freedom. The official record preserved in the files of county government and church registries tells a simple story of accidental death and natural disaster. According to these sources, Silas Croghan died from mistakenly consuming poisonous plants while attempting to treat minor ailments with folk remedies, and the subsequent fire that destroyed the family compound was caused by a lightning strike during an otherwise clear evening. This version of events satisfied the authorities, who investigated the incident, and continues to satisfy those who prefer their history sanitized and their moral universe clearly defined. It allows us to view the Croghan family as victims of circumstances beyond their control, rather than perpetrators of systematic evil, and it eliminates the troubling questions about community complicity that a more thorough investigation might have raised. But the alternative narrative, preserved in Ilara's own words and supported by a growing body of circumstantial evidence, presents a very different picture of what transpired in Blackwood Basin during those violent final hours. According to this version, Silas Croghan died from deliberate poisoning administered by a woman who had discovered the true nature of her captivity and chosen resistance over submission. The evidence supporting this interpretation continues to accumulate as historians and investigators examine the case with tools unavailable to their predecessors. The pattern of exploitation that Ilara's letter describes matches documented cases from other isolated communities during the same historical period. The systematic nature of the violence she exposed aligns with what we now understand about family-based criminal enterprises and their methods of operation. Most compelling of all is the voice that speaks to us across more than a century through the letter Ilara wrote to her sister, a voice that is clear, rational, and utterly unrepentant about what she had done and why she had chosen to do it. This is not the writing of a woman driven to madness by desperate circumstances, but of someone who had carefully analyzed her situation and selected the most effective response available to her. "I am not a murderer, sister," she wrote in those final, haunting lines. "I am a reaper, and I have harvested the rotten crop." The moral implications of accepting this version of events are profound and troubling. If Alara did indeed commit premeditated murder, can her actions be justified by the circumstances that drove her to such extremes? If the systematic exploitation she described was real, does her violence represent justice or simply revenge? And if the authorities who covered up the truth were motivated by a desire to protect the community's peace of mind, were they complicit in evil or simply pragmatic in their understanding of what the public could bear to acknowledge? These questions have no easy answers, which may explain why the official version of events has proven so durable despite its obvious inadequacies. It is easier to believe in accidents and natural disasters than to confront the possibility that systematic evil can flourish in plain sight when communities choose not to see what is happening before their eyes. But one thing can be stated with absolute certainty. Whatever happened on that August night in 1882, the cycle of exploitation and abuse that had characterized the Croghan family for generations was broken forever. No more women disappeared into Blackwood Basin to serve as experimental subjects in a twisted breeding program. No more unmarked graves appeared on the hillside above the compound. No more children were born into a genetic legacy of madness and deformity. Whether this result was achieved through divine intervention or human agency, whether it represents justice or merely the random intersection of desperation and opportunity, the outcome remains the same. Sometimes the rotten crop must indeed be harvested, and sometimes that harvest requires tools that civilized society prefers not to acknowledge. The story of Alara Vesta reminds us that history is written not just by victors, but by survivors, and that the difference between heroism and villainy often depends on which side of the fire you happen to be standing on when the flames finally die down. If you've made it this far into this dark journey through America's hidden history, consider subscribing to ensure you don't miss future explorations of the truths that official records tried to bury. The past has many more secrets waiting to be unearthed.